40,000 an acre to 600,000 an acre. That's a substantial increase.
On this project, we're looking at about a $10 million upswing, right, in value.
Welcome, everybody, this week to this week's episode of the Dynamis Podcast. We have a really, really useful episode coming your way, especially in today's market as up-and-coming investors are looking at deals. They're trying to analyze numbers, and nothing is making sense. Bigger Pockets tells us, hey, let's look at a deal and we try to meet the 1% rule, meaning roughly that rents should be about 1% of the purchase price in order to cash flow and make you positive every month. But everybody knows that in this market, in the competitive market, as prices are going up, as interest rates are going up, it's almost impossible to find a deal that works. And the reason I'm so excited for this week's episode is because I have brought in an expert in the arena of thinking creatively, thinking outside the box, and bringing value to a property that oftentimes would probably get overlooked. And we're going to dissect exactly how to do this. But before we jump into this week's show, I want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping first. Look, this show is a heavy lift. And if it's giving you any benefit at all in your life, I just have one simple ask. Give us a review. Rate the show. Give us a review. I read every single review that comes across the line. It takes about 20 seconds to leave a review. Do it. It helps us grow the show, grow the audience, and we're just trying to help as many people as possible. So please rate and review the show. And the last thing is if you are local in the Tacoma, Seattle, Olympia area, and you want to increase your network, increase your net worth, and your level of understanding, I host a meetup called Tacoma Pints Properties. We have it the first Tuesday of the month at Narrows Brewing, and we kick things off at 5:30. So if you're in the area, please come out, say hello, get in the room, and build up your network. With that, I would like to welcome to the studio this week Terry Wise, the founder and chairman of Terry Wise and Associates. Terry Wise and Associates is a real estate brokerage and land use consulting firm, and I would say from my personal experience, they are in the upper echelon, the tip of the spear, the top 1% of brokerages in the area that understands how to do what you do at the level that you do it. I constantly hear large national builders, developers are coming to you to seek advice and your expertise in how to get things done. And that's why I'm really, really excited and fortunate that we have you in the studio this week. So Terry, welcome.
Thank you.
Could you just give us a little bit of a summary of what you really specialize in?
So we're unique in that we have a wide spectrum of the services that we offer. Most brokerages focus on just residential or just commercial or just industrial or, land. And we specialize in each and every one of those, including, land development, leasing. So that wide perspective, I think, gives us a broader overview than most.
The reason that this podcast is even happening right now is because I had the privilege of sitting in the room during a conversation where you were approached by a local real estate agent who was trying to figure out what to do with a particular piece of property. They had no idea. There was an extra parcel in a developed area, and they were trying to figure out something to do because the person that had inhabited that property was getting on in years, and they no longer wanted the land. And the realtor thought there just has to be something bigger for this property that she personally couldn't see just because she had a lack of experience and understanding. And I was privileged to sit in that room as you gave a breakdown of possible outcomes and scenarios to increase the value of that property over time. And that's where the light bulb came on for me in that moment of, as an investor, I'm looking at things really, really linearly. I have a couple tools in my toolbox and how I'm evaluating properties, but really there's a whole other dynamic set of skill sets that can really bring unconventional value that's oftentimes overlooked. And that's how I was like, all right, I got to get Terry in this room. I want to start dissecting what he knows, how he knows this, and how you look at a property is totally different than how a general investor or buyer looks at a property. And that's what we're really here to uncover is your expertise in this land use, in the highest and best land use. I think that your origin is really powerful because it can connect with a lot of people. You didn't set out on your journey to do this specific thing. It kind of happened naturally. I'd love if you just gave the audience a quick background of how you got to where you are today.
Well, really out of almost desperation. I didn't know where I was going to land with a career. I thought I'd give the real estate gig a shot, and really didn't like real estate agents, so I didn't think I wanted to be one. Now, 38 years later, I'm still in it, and I love it more now than I ever have. But I start off just like everyone else, trying to sell a house here, a house there, and you start off working with buyers, and then you evolve to sellers. Now I've been doing that for 38 years. I was so fortunate early in my career. I happened to come across awesome mentors, whether they be land use attorneys, engineers, lawyers, brokers, and that just helped catapult me into what we do now, which is, as far as we know, unique.
And your initial listings, the original listings that you started taking, were farm properties, people with acreage, horses, but you're not just doing horse properties anymore. That was the path that led you to where you are now. Now, Terry Wise is a well-known firm that consults with major builders across the nation that are specifically seeking your expertise for highest and best use. But there has to be like one deal that started you down this path of thinking dynamically, thinking outside the box about land use.
You know, I don't recall it in any particular one. There's been so many in different facets, right? When I was first in real estate, had a client I'd sold a house to that was retiring from working at the post office. She had a couple of acres in town and had some chickens and ducks and rabbits and kind of old McDonald's farm. And she wanted to move out in the country and have a big plot of land, but had a very limited budget. And so she called me up one day, Judy was her name, so excited about this property she'd found. So I go out and look at it, and this is a old house on probably 15 acres, had a wonderful little pond with fish on it, tiny little dock and all of that. But it had a tin roof on it, and you could see the stars at night without getting outside. There's holes in the roof and straw for insulation, wood floors that you could see the animals run underneath the house under. So it was obviously something that wasn't financeable, and it had been listed as cash only. My client didn't have that cash to buy it, but she wanted it with all her heart, right? So I'm like, okay, how do we make this work? Called the listing broker, who was an old seasoned professional, and he says, yeah, cash only. It's the only way we can do this because it's in bankruptcy. And of course, it's non-financeable. So that's the only way we can do it. And that started me on a journey to prove everybody wrong that we could get this house for Judy. So through some investigation, we found that we could buy it on a real estate contract, have a third-party investor that would buy the contract at escrow as part of closing, so we could provide the cash to the bankruptcy court so they would approve it. And Judy lived out the rest of her life in that house, and that was a real rewarding moment for me. And also was kind of landmark in that don't take that conventional wisdom of what you can and can't do. There's a lot more opportunities out there than what most people, recognize. And so look and think outside the box.
Some of the best advice that I ever got when I started this journey is if somebody tells you no, go ask somebody else until somebody says yes, and just keep asking.
Absolutely.
For everybody listening, when Terry's talking about the property being non-financeable, if you've never purchased a property before, when you get a loan, especially a loan that's insured by the government, USDA, VA, Fannie, Freddie, whatever, when you get one of these loans that are insured, there's certain requirements that have to be met in order for that loan to fund. And if it doesn't check those boxes, then financing with a conventional mortgage, fixed mortgage over time, is just out of the question. And so you have to move on to things like, niche non-QM products, which tend to be very expensive, or you need to use hard money or come with cash. And so obviously Judy had no money, and your heart was client first. You have a servant's heart. I've noticed that over time. I sit in on your brokerage meetings once a month, and it's very front and center. I think that's a really important story because that is the foundational story that led to Terry Wise today. And people told you no, and your heart was, how do I serve Judy? And you went out and found a yes, and you found a yes in a very dynamic and unconventional way. Do you recall the property that you and I had discussed? There was a bunch of farmland. It was like Berry Farms. It was two neighboring families. They were listed as agricultural property. And you came on as a consultant and found the highest and best use of this property, and it was to join their combined acres and rezone it as a commercial. Could you kind of walk through that scenario?
And in fact, that's a project we're currently working on.
Are you at liberty to discuss it?
Yeah, in general terms.
Okay.
So we were contacted by some folks that had been referred to us by their attorney. Buyer had come in and said, hey, we'd like to buy your property. Here's an offer. $1.4 million, I think, for this property. And
how many acres was it?
It was 13 and a half acres on 6 parcels. 2 of the parcels were zoned commercial, CG. It was a specific zoning, but it was zoned commercial. The other 4 parcels were zoned agricultural. There was 3 residences on the property and historically been used for farming. And so they had gone to the attorney and said, well, is this a good offer? And the attorney said, well, I can look at the contract for the legal sufficiency, but as far as whether it's a good value, call Terry. And so they contacted me, and we did some research and provided what we call a preliminary valuation report, which isn't that different than a market analysis or appraisal, except for we look at it in the broad scope, not only what's the snapshot today of the value's worth, but are there some things that we could change that would significantly affect the value?
This attorney came to you and asked, is this a good evaluation? And your first thought, your dynamic thinking was, okay, well, this is how it is today, but is it truly the highest and best use? And is there something that we could do to bring a far greater value and impact everybody? Right?
That's correct.
That's what you do. That's your niche.
That's what we do,
yeah.
Right? What was interesting, there were some unique features that affected the valuation. On 3 sides of this property was a railroad loop. All of their access into the property, which there was 3 accesses, came over the railroad tracks, and they'd been doing that since before the railroad, right? But 120 years or something like that. But the railroad had been there since the 50s. But they didn't have what we call unfettered access. In other words, they didn't have legal access like a 30-foot access or 50-foot access. The only access they had is what we call prescriptive access, which meant they had used that access for long enough and through under adverse possession laws that they had obtained a prescriptive easement rights. That meant they couldn't restrict that access further, but it also is very different from I can get across there to do some farming or a residence, but I can't build a shopping mall in there. So having that restricted access really affected the future marketability. On the other side of the property, the 4th side, was a newly improved major arterial, and it was like an overpass. And the city had put in a kind of an access point, what we call a bump out, that showed that that was to access this property. Problem is, that's about a $3 million improvement. There was only 6 acres that were zoned commercial. The rest is agricultural, which could use the existing access, so there was no real value to them. The 6 acres, if they had to put that whole $3 million improvement in, that's $500,000 an acre. That really devalues that property. Now, when we looked at it as a whole, there was another 10 and a half acres next to it that's also zoned agricultural, currently used for farming, but we're going to be in the same boat. So we put our valuation together for the whole thing, which was roughly the whole 24 acres to be about $2.5 million, the way it sat. However, if we were to put that whole 24 acres together and convince the city to rezone it to commercial, we would then increase the value to probably $12 million. And now this improved $3 million improvement to come in, instead of being $500,000 an acre, is now down to $100,000 an acre, which is a tolerable level to still give value to the land. And it increased the land from about $40,000 an acre for the agricultural to $600,000 an acre for the commercial.
$40,000 an acre to $600,000 an acre. That's a
right.
substantial increase.
On this project, we're looking at about a $10 million upswing, right, in value.
And think about this, that attorney that had no idea what he was really looking at as far as an evaluation, who handed that off to you. What was the initial offer? 1.5 million?
1.4, yeah.
1.4 to a $10 million upswing on that. Mm-hmm. Substantial.
It's a lot.
A lot.
Yeah, that's a bunch for most of us.
That is a bunch. And this is where we're really finding opportunity where other people aren't looking, and we're juicing all of that opportunity in today's market. And to stay alive, this is what we have to do. A couple questions I have on this process is, number one, you talked about that bump out. I'm assuming what you're talking about is like the start of a road that's blocked off that says, potential future development or something like that.
Yep.
We've all driven by them before. Is that up to you, the landowner, to fulfill that cost? That's like things like water, electric, that sewer, that type of stuff?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
And more the municipalities, jurisdictions are trying to put more and more of the burden for infrastructure, whether it's sewer, stormwater, roads, traffic signals, that stuff, onto the landowner or the developer. We've got another project we're doing now that the sewer needs to be extended 2 miles. They're trying to put it all on the landowner. We have to put in one of those major 2-lane roundabouts to the tune of about $3.5 million. They want the landowner, the developer, to absorb all that cost. Now, that becomes a negotiation, and another way that we add value on that particular project. Those types of infrastructure and expenses are, we think, about $18 million when you add the whole cost to it. We've now negotiated some reimbursement agreements, shared cost agreements with both the state and the county that has cut that down to, we think our total investment is going to be less than $5 million. So that means that value is added right back into the land, because the value of the land is in direct correlation to the cost to develop it, right? So, that's huge. And on this particular project, that's really what we brought to the table, as well as negotiating with ultimately the buyer, who's a national builder, is to make that land as valuable as possible by eliminating a lot of the cost to develop it.
You said that the municipalities are pushing that cost of development, the infrastructure, more and more onto the landowner. Is that a recent change? How long has that been?
No, it's been progressing for many, many years, and different jurisdictions, municipalities handle that differently. But the idea is if I'm going to, let's say I'm going to do a 50-lot subdivision, and they say it's 10 trips a day, I'm going to have 500 more cars going in and out of that area. And so those are going to put impacts on the roads, right? And so they look at the road and say, well, this road has already got too much traffic, and so your impacts are going to basically make the road so it's unsafe, too much traffic. And so then it would be up to the developer, based on his impacts, to have to bring it back into compliance at least as good as it was before they were there. But that's now evolved into, now we're going to have you improve the road so we don't have to spend any money improving it down the road. And not only the road in front of you and that intersection, but down the road and around the corner and all that. So it's one of the biggest impediments for developing now is that the municipalities are putting such a financial burden on the landowner developer. It gets to the point where they just can't afford to develop. And that's, in my mind, the largest single impediment we have in Washington as far as our housing crisis, providing affordable housing, is that you can't afford to develop. And so therefore, no houses.
You had mentioned this is something that you battle constantly. There was a waste removal problem that you guys were dealing with under asphalt, and there was just like no logic in the billing of this waste removal. They were requiring you to like have a specialist come in, dig it up, and then ship it. Where was it? Across the country or something?
Well, yeah, a long ways away. Well, initially we could ship it wherever we could find the cheapest place to ship it. However, due to some legislative changes, then it was then required that we dispose of it within the county if there was a local disposal site. As soon as that ordinance was passed, the local depository tripled their dump fees. So our dump fees went from 1.4 million to, I think it was almost 5 million in what the dump fees would be. So took all the fun out of that.
Yeah. And a lot of this development is just really comes down to common sense legislation that seems to be an impediment. And I know that a big fight you have is, this affordable housing, common sense forward, legislation. And it seems like, you're on the cutting edge of fighting that battle every single day and just trying to bring awareness to some of these what seems like silly issues from the surface of very easily fixable items that would benefit the community that we both live in and you serve, every single day.
Once I started going down this land use journey 30 some odd years ago, again, I had a mentor that was a land use attorney and an engineer, so a very unique perspective and a great perspective. One of the first things he taught me is that land use is not a common sense, practical issue. It is a political issue, right? And so we have the politicians making those decisions, and just as in my meeting with one of those folks today, good guy, trying to do the right thing, but he's not a land use expert, and yet he's, a council member that votes on these things all the time, and they don't know enough about what they don't know enough about in order to make good decisions. And consequently, a lot of our policy and legislation is almost lunacy, right?
I would agree. And it seems that it's not just, on local ordinances that legislators are making decisions on things that they don't understand, but I would say at the state and federal level as well. So
maybe worse. Well, I think the state's worse, and our state's one of the worst. But that's another.
That's a whole other episode. Yeah, I want to circle back to the example that we were talking about with the joining acreage, the initial 6 parcels that you then would combine to the 24 usable acres. Rezone that as what was it? Industrial?
Well, actually, what we want to do is we would like to create a new zoning for that jurisdiction that broadens the usage, right? When I first got into real estate, they say, hey, the key factor to establishing value in real estate is location, location, location. And as my career evolved, we started getting into commercial real estate. It was like, oh, the issue is in commercial, it's location, location times 10, right? And then as my career has evolved and I've learned more, I realized that the most important factor in establishing value in real estate is the zoning. What is my permitted use on the property? What am I allowed to do with it? And in today's world, the jurisdiction municipalities try to pigeonhole the zoning. So they want, this is specifically for this and specifically for that. Unfortunately, a lot of times that doesn't meet the market.
Right.
And I was telling this legislator this morning that if you want to be sure to create a blight in the community, there's 2 ways to do that for sure. One is to zone the property wrong, and the second is to build something that doesn't meet the market. And so both of those are important. And oftentimes the planners that work within the jurisdictions don't know anything about the market side of things, and so they zone properties wrong, and again, they pigeonhole it, and if it doesn't meet the market, then it doesn't get developed. And so in this particular case, we want it to be a commercial zoning, but at the time that it gets developed, maybe industrial is going to be the best bet. So if we have the option to do both, or all the above, then that gives us maximum value.
And that's exactly what I wanted to segue into. You talked about a $10.5 million upswing from the initial evaluation to highest and best use. And you said, there you go. There you have it. You just now all it comes down to is convincing the legislators to let us use the property how we want it to be used. Well, how realistic is that? What do the timelines look like on something like that? And how difficult of a battle do you face when you're changing the usage of property like that originally is agricultural and has potentially a better use now?
And that's a great question, right? Things we look at is, what's the political environment look like? Can we get the votes we need? Can we get the support of the staff? If we can't, how do we solicit the support? And that's a whole thing. We're pretty good at going in and evaluating that. And so our success rate on rezones currently is 100%.
Wow.
But there's ones we've looked at that we didn't think we could be successful, so we didn't take them on. Unfortunately, with the Urban Growth Act and their procedures and policies, the quickest I've done a rezone is just less than 3 years, and most of them are 4.
So this is definitely a long timeline trajectory here. When you're doing this type of work, you have to be mindful of the future without a doubt.
Yeah, on the rezones, there's a couple other avenues that you can do a rezone on a somewhat quicker process, and they work, PDDs, development agreements, those types of things. But for the most part, for average Joe, really, it's a rezone.
I want to switch gears slightly because I want to talk about something else that it's in the arena of what your expertise is, but here in Washington State and, locally, there's been a lot of new legislation increase the density usage of properties in areas like, downtown Tacoma, Seattle, and we're seeing it sprawl outward. And one of the things that really piqued my interest about you is you talking about tax parcels as a separation from a lot, for example. And when you started talking about that, all of these scenarios started running through my head. You gave one example in a meeting I was sitting in with you, how there was one lot, I believe, but there was actually 3 separate tax parcels, and they could be sectioned off. One of those parcels could have been sectioned off to fund the construction of 2 additional units or something along those lines. And that's when my mind started running wild. And especially in the new environment that we're heading into, where ADUs are becoming allowable, especially in urban areas and high density areas. And 2025, we're slotted to have an increase in the allowable usage of ADUs from 1 to 2 on a single family residence in downtown areas like Proctor, for example, UP. I'd love to kind of dig into this a little bit because this is exactly what I had in mind when I'm talking about looking at a property as an investor and seeing the highest and best use, not just what is the value today, can it cash flow, but how do I increase the value moving forward? And I'd love if you just spoke about the differentiation between parcels, lots, and how we can really increase value as investors in today's market.
How much time do you have, Tim?
We got about 10 minutes left.
Okay, well, that's a high level. But I think to start that discussion, people should recognize, most people will look and say, oh, there's a parcel of land, there's a tax parcel, and they immediately think that the tax parcel and a legal lot are the same thing. They are not. There's times when I have one parcel and multiple legal lots, and there's times I have multiple parcels and one legal lot. And I've seen people make huge mistakes in making that assumption. Before a lot can be created as a separate legal lot, it has to do one of 2 things. It has to be legally subdivided by the subdivision regulations in that jurisdiction, or if you subdivide it through what's called an exemption, and there's 9 exemptions in Washington State from the subdivision code. Couldn't recite you all 9, but one is what they call exempt segregation, where each lot's over 20 acres. There's another exempt segregation that once you do a preliminary plat or PDD or planned district, unit district, then you can do that into 5-acre lots, okay? One that we use a lot is what we call a testamentary exemption, which means I can subdivide property without regard to the subdivision code through a will. So you got, Father Jones that's had the family farm, and it's, 20 acres, and, he gets old, and the kids are saying, well, when he dies, we're just going to sell the farm, and the zoning only allows for 1 unit per 10 acres, so you got 4 lots. Well, let's say he had 10 kids. Through the testamentary exemption, he could will that to his 10 children, and then they can go in and do a record of survey and say, we have 10 lots. And there have been cases when we've got one in Yakima we're doing right now that's going to, about 50% increase in the value, and it's a pretty quick process, 2 weeks sometimes, in order to do that. And I think the one you're asking me about, the segregation is similar. This one that I'm speaking of now was done not as a testamentary exemption, but as what we call an exempt segregation. So these lots were created in 1897 through a big plat, big subdivision. And then in subsequent years, oftentimes people would combine the lots into larger parcels, mainly for tax purposes, that they didn't have to have, in this case, 11 tax statements. They could just have 3. And they figured they were going to be building on bigger lots. These were the old 25-foot lots. Depending on how those lots were combined for tax purposes into larger parcels, whether they, in today's world, if you combine them, you lose the legal lot status. This was done many years ago, and so we still had 11 legal lots, even though there was only 3 tax parcels. And so we went back through a tax exempt segregation where we did a record of survey and then went down to the assessor's office. And from a practical standpoint, 11 lots wouldn't work. So we created, I believe it was 6 lots. And so within about 2 weeks, we turned 2 lots into 5 and then had a separate lot and increased the value by at least $500,000. I won't go into the rest of the transaction, but it was kind of interesting how we were able to convey some of the lots to a builder to bring the cash to the table, because my landowner didn't have enough cash to do the deal. So we basically partnered up with the builder and, again, conveyed those lots, which became the down payment to close on the original deal. We had to get creative to make it happen.
Right there. That right there is incredible. That strategy of conveying the lots to the builder in lieu of down payment to close on the deal because buyer was short on funds, really. Mm-hmm. Through creativity.
He didn't have any money in that deal. Yeah. I mean, the end result was he ended up with about a $400,000 house free and clear without putting any money into it.
I don't think you understand how much of a gold mine you have stored away up in here. You're so cavalier about all of these transactions. It's just like what you do. You're like, oh yeah, and that one story, there's way too much material to cover. This is just like an introduction to land use. Like, how do we find the highest and best use? And I think what might be interesting in the future is to potentially do some case studies on individual niches within this, I guess, subcategory, because there's just so much value right there. What you just said right there. That's going to make somebody $1 million, without a doubt. It's going to make somebody a millionaire. Just what you said right there. It's so creative. It's outside the box thinking. It's right in front of all of our faces. It just comes down to nobody knows what they're doing. And, sitting here having this conversation, I've been investing, 6 years, I guess now, coming up on 6 years. And I don't know any of this stuff. I don't even know the terminology that you're using, plats and parcels. And I think we might need to have you in here just for a terminology podcast so that we can start understanding. Because look, moving forward in the environment that we're in, you have to get creative and you have to think outside the box. And if you're not thinking dynamically and you're not partnering with people like Terry and your firm, there's just no way you're going to make it. Especially everybody else is just as hungry as the next guy. Everybody's competing for the scraps. And so, as I'm sitting here processing what you're talking about, all I could think to myself is, how would I be navigating this on my own? If there's somebody out there who is interested in land development and reuse, how do they even start? Because all I can think of is I find the land and then I bring it to Terry and see what we can do with it.
Yeah, that's a good approach.
I mean, is it even reasonable for somebody to, I'm sure anybody can accomplish anything, but this is a life's work, a lifetime of work for you to have this type of knowledge and network.
Yeah, this is the culmination of 38 years of being consumed in this stuff and loving every minute of it, right? From my perspective, the good Lord above gave me a aptitude that seems to be able to retain this stuff. But yeah, that's what you need to do is if you're going to be getting into land, you got to have somebody that's an expert in land use. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with a broker, been in the business 23 years, successful, and had a piece of land that they thought they could do a deal with, a 65-lot subdivision. And after about a 20-minute phone call, I just told her, I'm sorry, everything that you've talked about doing is flat out wrong.
Really?
Flat out wrong. And if you take that approach, you are not going to be successful. And fortunately, she listened, and, we're actually may have coffee later today and sit down and see if we can't get her on the right track so that she can represent the landowner so that they can do a lot better than what they would without.
Something that I want to bring attention to as well before we wrap up is exactly what you're talking about right now, where you're going to meet and have coffee. I have heard you offer this over and over and over again. Local agents, even if they work for different brokerages, they have a client, they have a piece of land, they don't know what to do with it. I've heard you, I've witnessed you, I've seen you stop what you're doing and take meetings with agents that work for other brokerages, just hand-holding them and helping them through this process, because you want more people to have this knowledge. You want more people to have this understanding, and you want to help them navigate through this process, which is something that I think it's very beneficial to everybody involved, to the community that they're serving, the client, the buyer, the seller.
I've got kids that can't, buy the house that they want or really big enough to suit their needs because it's too expensive and they can't do it. And we have a real housing crisis, right? And so, my knowledge can help solve that, maybe just in a little way. And the whole idea of paying it forward, right? We need to try to get more people can do this, because the land use side of things, there's just not very many people that does what we do.
For the audience that's listening, that's maybe not local, for example, that can't just walk into Terry Wise and Associates. For those out there that are interested in land development, they have no idea where to get started, they have no network, and they have no Terry in their local community, what are 3 tangible things that we can leave the audience with to start assessing and evaluating land as they're looking at these deals and evaluating it?
First and foremost, most people, when they say, okay, I don't know, what can I do or what can't I do with a given piece of property, they hop in their car, drive down to the local building department or planning department and talk to the person across the desk and say, what can I do or what can't I do with the property? Understand that about 90% of the time you're going to get the wrong answers. Okay, it's that person that doesn't know what they don't know, and they're going to give you wrong information. And so in today's world with technology, most of those zoning or codes are online. And you can look on there with some basic learning and see what the zoning is, what the permitted uses and non-permitted uses are for that particular zoning. You can even look at setbacks and height restrictions and design guidelines. It's laid out there in the code. So if you don't have somebody, and again, that's not something you're going to learn overnight. And so typically, if you can get somebody, an engineering firm, an architect, that type of thing, to help navigate at least the first time. And so zoning, restrictions, permitted uses, GIS information. Is there wetlands? Is there severe slopes? Is it in a aquifer recharge area? Those types of, all kinds of things that you can determine pretty quickly what I can and can't do with the property. Each zoning has different densities. Example, Pierce County, RR zoning, can be 2 to 4 lots per acre. SF zoning is 4 lots per acre. MSF, 4 to 6 units per acre. Then you get into some of your mud zonings, and that can be 15 units per acre. Or high density residential can be 30 units per acre. That's all going to determine value. One of the basics is different jurisdictions have what they call either gross density or net density. In a gross density, if they say it's 5 units per acre and I got 5 acres, that means I have 25 units. Pierce County example is a net density jurisdiction that says before I calculate my densities, I have to take out for the roads that are going to be built, and have to take out all critical areas, wetlands, severe slopes, anything over a 6% 6% slope is considered severe slope, and then I have to get a geotech assessment and on. But so if I have 10 acres, but 4 acres of it is encumbered by critical areas in the roads, then my net developable acreage is 6. So if my density is 5, instead of having 10 acres times 5 is 50 lots, if I've got 6 acres times 5, I've got 30 lots. And people make those mistakes all the time and then pay way too much for the dirt and then realize that this development is just for education, not for money.
How often do we all pay for education? But the goal is to try to prevent that as much as possible.
That's right. That's right.
Terry, I can feel myself being forcibly drawn to this topic. And I think there's something about my personality where if I don't understand something, I just want to immerse myself in it. And this is so outside of my current level of understanding. All I want to do is follow you around and soak up as much of this information as possible. And I know that before we get out of here, we're just about out of time. I've sat in on your brokerage meetings several times, and I feel really privileged to do so. And you guys have a mission statement that I think really, really resonates with the path and the mission that you're on. And out of curiosity, I was wondering if you would be so kind as to part this episode with sharing a snippet of that mission statement with us.
Yeah, happy to, and we call it our vision story. And it starts, we believe a house can represent a home, raw land can represent a dream, and land use consulting can be a mechanism for community service and social change. So we aim to help our clients love their homes, build their dreams, and together create a community that we can all be proud of. We value people over profit while maintaining a fiduciary to the clients and staff we support to make business decisions that ensure our collective financial success.
Yeah. And I really just feel that's on target for what you're living out every single day. Terry, I know that your time is incredibly valuable. You're one of the busiest people I know. I feel like people are calling you all the time, following you around, chasing you down for answers. So I cannot express to you enough how grateful I am to have you here. I would be honored if we could dive into additional topics in the future. You touched on one thing right as we were exiting, and I thought, oh my gosh, I wanted to talk about that, but we ran out of time, and that's wetland mitigation, like moving wetlands for developable land. There's just so many things that you could do with land, and then we're just scratching the surface. So I really, really do hope that we can get you back and talk about more in the future. I know social media is not your favorite thing in the world, but I'm going to go ahead and put all of the contact information to get a hold of you in the show notes. So for everybody listening, go ahead and check out the show notes. I have Terry Wise and Associates website posted below and their social media. Go ahead and give them a follow. Check them out. They're doing big things up here throughout the entire state of Washington. Hope you guys got some value out of this week's episode, and we will definitely bring Terry back in here either forcibly or with his gentle agreement. Anyways, thank you guys for listening to this week's episode. We will catch you all on the flip side.